Welcome, good morning, good afternoon to those of you online, and thank you to everybody who is here in the audience and who's viewing at home. Welcome to the Hudson Institute. We are so grateful to be joined by Kirlinki Salasta-Ling, who is the Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia. Previously, you served in several positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as Director General of the Department for NATO and Transatlantic Relations, Ambassador at the Permanent Representation of Estonia to NATO, and prior to that you served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs at the MFA of Estonia and DCM at the Estonian Embassy here in Washington, D.C., where I think we met many years ago, probably when I was just starting out. We're just so delighted to have you here. Estonia is a terrific country, a terrific ally. And we're really here to celebrate. I think both to look back at the relationship, your 20 years in NATO, but also to look forward at the challenges and the opportunities that the alliance has. So with that, I would like to welcome you to give us some framing thoughts to open the discussion. Thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be back in Washington. And I know that the focus today will be on NATO, but let me just wish everybody a happy Europe Day. It's the 9th of May. And just like this year, we're celebrating 20 years of membership in NATO, we're also celebrating 20 years of membership of the European Union, and both organizations have been truly important for Estonia's development, security, and prosperity. But coming to the NATO issue, if I may, I would like to start just a little bit even before joining NATO, just to give a sort of a sense of how important the accession was for us. It was a total game changer in terms of security. And, you know, I think it was our former president, Lennart Meri, who said you can never have too much security. A country like Estonia, who's a direct neighbor of Russia, can never have too much security, and indeed it's true. When we joined NATO, though, we certainly increased our security quite significantly. There's no doubt about that. And with everything going on in Europe right now, the full-scale war, it has really raised a lot of questions in Estonia, also linked to the fact that we have the 20-year anniversary, and people are asking, you know, what would have happened if we had not joined NATO? If we hadn't been taken into NATO, if NATO hadn't decided to actually take in, for example, the Baltic states. And you know, I think the conclusion that most Estonians or people reach is that we would probably be in a similar situation to what Ukraine is in now if we hadn't joined the alliance. So some of the lessons we learned, why we started even going towards NATO was, one was that we understood from the occupation, from the Second World War, that freedom is not free. You need to fight for your freedom, no matter what the odds are. And the second big lesson that has been a driving force for our security policy has been never alone. This principle that we should never be alone again. And so that's why when we regained our independence in '91, we decided immediately to try and integrate with all Euro-Atlantic structures possible. Above all, that meant, of course, NATO and the European Union, but that was what was sort of driving us to do it. And just to recall, there was a lot of skepticism in European capitals, also here in Washington, D.C., about expanding to or taking in Baltic states. And there have been several books written about this, and now that archives have started opening up, you can see how much skepticism there actually was, and how much prejudice there was, and how we had to fight really hard to, you know, first of all, even say who we are and why we deserve to be, you know, treated just like, for example, Central European allies who of course joined the alliance 5 years before us. And maybe just to quickly go through some of the key lessons that we learned during the how to get into NATO, what we did, and why we're also giving these messages now and these lessons, sharing them with some of other countries, like, for example, Ukraine. And I think the first thing that we did and why we were successful is that we did our homework. We really worked hard. All of our sort of political leaders, diplomats, civil servants, military. Everybody worked in the name of getting into NATO. And we didn't, I think, ask for any sort of concessions. We had a checklist of things that we were asked to do, and we did them. It sounds simple, but somehow it wasn't that we sort of had a special trick that we didn't trick our way into NATO. I think we really delivered. We understood that we need to be a good ally. We need to fulfill not just or expect Article 5 when we get in, but we also need to start working from day one on Article 3, on our own defense capabilities, on being ready to defend ourselves, to do as much as we can, and then also contribute to common operations and other things. So hard work was really a key. I think we were also lucky at having the right people in the right place at the right time. And I really believe in sort of key good leaders at the right time can really make all the difference, especially for a small country like us. And I think we were just really lucky with having people with a vision, with the political will to carry out, to take us into NATO and the European Union for that matter. So, and they brought all of society with them together. I think, joining NATO was an all of society kind of a task that we fulfilled. And maybe just finally a sort of another lesson that we learned was also that we were politically speaking or foreign policy-wise lucky. In a way, because, we weren't lucky because a window of opportunity opened up, unfortunately, due to the extremely tragic events of 9/11. But it opened up a window because NATO-Russia relations, for a brief period of time, improved. Everybody was fixated on working, and rightly so, on fighting terrorism together. And that sort of brought down the tension when it came to the issue of Baltic membership in NATO. And it sort of drew the attention away from the whole discussion on, are the Baltic states defendable or not? Some of you may recall of this. And so it was in 2012 2002, sorry, I'm even going further back at the Prague summit, where actually the key decision was made by then President George W. Bush, that we need to take the Baltic states in because it's the right thing to do. So as always, it's a combination of many things. It's not just one factor that sort of determines how things go in history, but I can say it was a bit of luck, but it was also a lot of hard work. And then we joined, and I'm happy to sort of answer questions also about how I think we've been doing and what actually NATO membership has given us. So.
Well, thank you for those terrific and wide-reaching opening thoughts. I think you've given us a lot of windows that we can discuss over the next hour or so here. So 75 years this year for the NATO alliance as a whole. There was a remarkable letter which surfaced last year, which showcased Estonia's interest in joining NATO at its very inception. And so I want to quote an Estonian diplomat, Jonas Kyiv, who wrote that Estonia is still under the illegal occupation and domination of the Soviet Union and is therefore prevented from manifesting openly its keen interest in this pact. He goes on to write, I express the belief that countries which were forcibly deprived of self-government and independence will benefit by this noble endeavor. And so during these extremely trying times in Estonia's history, NATO, I think, in a lot of ways served as sort of a lighthouse, a guidepost for a better future. And that future is now. And so I think speaking to Americans today, where there's this sort of nascent, small skepticism about NATO, about the U.S. role overseas, could you talk about, for your fellow Estonians, what NATO means to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, it means, as I was saying before, it means security, and it means, as I was saying, also that we're not alone. I think it's been, as I was saying, a total game changer, being part of an alliance, knowing that we're not we're not alone. We don't have to. We have responsibilities, but we also have expectations as to when it comes to our security. And if you look at where we're also situated, I mean, geography plays a huge role, and it always will, especially when it comes to security, threat perceptions. That's one of the things you see very clearly in NATO. But NATO also works as a sort of a fora for bringing the different interpretations and perceptions together. That's not to say that we have necessarily exactly the same threat perception as, say, some of our allies in the south of Europe, or who are further away, let's say, from Russia or from the eastern flank. But it does help as an alliance to sort of bring together as many different perspectives as possible. And I'm a firm believer in Article 5 in the sense that I like the fact that it's simple, it's short, and sometimes it's criticized for being too ambiguous. But I think that's the ambiguity is it's sort of, that's what makes it so special. It's good because it is so ambiguous. It doesn't specify exactly when. I think allies will know when it's Article 5.
I think that's true. And you talk about Estonians, how they view this. So support at the time of your joining NATO is about 70% or so, give or take. It's now around 80%. It's hard to get much higher. Has public perception of the alliance changed? Has it stayed relatively steady, would you say?
Mm-hmm. It's been steady. It's been always very high, I think, comparing to a lot of different allied countries. And we don't have to, I think, explain too much about why it's important to be in NATO, what NATO does. But I think what's helped a lot has been also allied increased presence, physical presence, military presence in Estonia, in our region. Mm-hmm. And that has certainly changed a lot from when we joined. We started off in a situation where we didn't have air policing, we didn't have EFP, so allied forces, and now we've because of the situation, because of the security situation, we've now achieved that. I think it's really important, actually, that we have, allies in our region permanently there, okay, on a rotational basis, but nevertheless, who familiarize themselves with the presence. And the presence is important, and Estonians see it. They see the airplanes, they see the fighters, they see the troops in Tapa. UK, also a lot of American forces there. And all of that is, I think, really important. People know that it's important, and they know also that it's not, each ally decides on their own where they deploy their forces. So I think they have an understanding that it's not a given that we're going to have allies in Estonia, in our territory. And it's something that we need to work on. We need to be a good ally to keep interest in us. We need to contribute to operations. Right now, there aren't very many NATO operations anymore, but I think we have always tried to do as much as we can also in other regions.
That's absolutely right. I think when you talk about threat perception, here in the United States, obviously it's a very different threat perception because of our geography. The U.S. has this long-standing aversion to standing armies. So in the First and Second World Wars, we basically had to create armies from scratch around a small nucleus. But Estonia, of course, is very different because of your geography. When you go to the border, you can see the Russian flag and the Russian forces, and so there's always this sort of menacing threat there. And so now there's this debate about Russia's ability to reconstitute its forces outside of Ukraine, right? And so what the level of threat is and what the time horizon is. What is your view? What is the Estonian view in terms of the Russian conventional threat to the alliance moving forward, and what those time horizons are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about on the time horizon, and different numbers have been thrown out, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, all of this. And I don't think anybody knows today exactly, how long it will take for the Russians to reconstitute their army and their forces once the war in Ukraine ends. But one thing that we are absolutely certain of, given everything that we know about Russia and our experience, is that they will reconstitute their forces. And I think all of their military leadership has also said quite openly that as soon as they can, they're going to rebuild their forces on their western flank, which will always be a priority for them because it's their border with NATO, and NATO is, of course, the sort of the opponent's enemy that they've said. So I think they're never going to leave their western flank unattended, if I can put it that way. So they will definitely return to focus. I mean, I think right now, clearly the focus for them is in Ukraine and further south. But that doesn't mean that they won't be back, in a way, if I can put it that way. And I think they will put a lot of effort into that as soon as they can. And they're not, they haven't completely taken their eye off of us either. And I think we've been seeing in recent weeks and months also an uptick of Russian hybrid activity, which has also been reported. You're hearing in Europe overall, not just, I would say, and I'm not sure if it's the same here in the U.S., but I think they're not leaving us unattended, if I can put it that way.
I think that's absolutely right. In a lot of ways, it seems that the sort of gray zone aggression is almost reaching a crescendo. So I know that Estonia recently lodged a complaint over the GPS jamming, but yeah. There's so many examples from the Havana Syndrome attacks against U.S. diplomats, the attacks against critical infrastructure, the sabotage of weapons depots. And so this all sort of falls below that Article 5, right? And so how should the alliance be responding to this, what seems to be increase in gray zone aggression and lack of response, or at least coherent response from the allies?
Well, you probably saw that there was, I think it was just last week, might have even been this week, there was a NAC statement out on the sort of hybrid activity. So I think there's a couple of things that can be done. One is, of course, information exchange. It's like a puzzle. We're seeing one bit here, one piece there. The first thing is, I think, to try and put it together. I think we're there already. We're sharing information, putting all of these sort of hybrid events of a different nature together, and it's forming a picture. So that's maybe the first thing. Then one tactic I think that we can use is sort of talking about these things publicly, outing sort of the situation, saying, look, these things are happening, and not just leaving and saying, oh, it'll sort of blow over. So you mentioned the GPS jamming. You're right. This happens in many different fora. So it's not just in the Baltic region or the Baltic Sea region. It's happening in the Mediterranean, other places. But why we decided to actually sort of publicly basically draw attention to it was because it actually affected very directly civil aviation, in Estonia. And yes, it was just a couple of flights that had to return back to Finland, but still, it was, it's already, I think, showing the general trend. What we can also do is attribute, and I know it's a bit of a sensitive issue sometimes, and for some allies, some want to attribute, some not so much. But nevertheless, I think if we don't attribute more, then also we don't see a solution. And so there are some things that we can do, and also NATO has a resilience. Sort of resilience has been on the agenda for a while, and we can work in ways to build up our own sort of resilience to fight these kinds of hybrid attacks. So all in all, but it is tricky. I have to say, it's tricky to come up with kind of one solution or response.
That's right. You're absolutely right about civilians, certainly the aviation, and then there's been examples in Norway, for instance, of first responders losing GPS signals, and so issues there. And so I think calling attention to those is a first step, I think, to be able to attribute that these nefarious activities. So you mentioned just a short while ago, Estonia's forces have reliably really proven one of the most active contributors, I think, to NATO missions over the past 20 years of your membership. And your nation has paid for this in blood and treasure. Since 2004, 11 Estonians have been killed in action and 120 wounded. And so how is your experience, how is the country's experience taking part in these NATO missions, most of them out of area operations, shaped not only your views of membership, but also this interoperability with allies?
Well, I was saying, I think we started recognizing or paying attention to this and participating also in joint operations even before becoming a member of the alliance, and we just continued with that policy. So you mentioned, yes, the casualties and the impact most in Afghanistan, but also some in Iraq. These are, of course, have had an impact, but I think there's also been a lot of understanding of how important it is to contribute. We can't expect allies to contribute to our security, to be present in Estonia, unless we contribute elsewhere also and take part in joint operations. So, also mentioning the Western Balkans is one region where we've been. We were in Africa up until a few years ago. This was not a NATO mission, but with the French in Operation Barkhane in Mali, for example, for quite a number of years. And we've also contributed to EU missions, again in Mali, Central African Republic. So I think all of that, there's quite a lot of understanding actually on how that you need to, as I was saying, freedom's not free. You need to make a contribution on your own side if you want others to also have that solidarity and unity with you. So.
I think that's absolutely true, and it's always this tricky question of sort of squaring the threat perception circle within the alliance. So clearly, I think for most members, Russia is the preeminent threat, but there's also, of course, the challenges and threats coming from China. For many southern members, it's the instability coming from North Africa and the Middle East. And so do you think that at the upcoming Washington summit that there's going to be a lot of disagreement about the prioritization within the alliance in terms of threat perception? Or do you think that we basically have crossed that Rubicon and everyone agrees that Russia is the preeminent threat that needs to receive the most resources from allies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think the strategic concept that was adopted in 2022 does a pretty good job of actually describing the Russian threat as the most immediate and threat to the alliance. So I think we have a lot of good kind of, language that we can use and build upon. And I think some of the nuances or the differences in nuances will be ironed out as usual in the communique negotiations before the summit. So I don't think anyone at the summit will actually start sort of arguing over is the greatest threat to Russia, or is China or whatever. But I do think though that when it comes to sort of this summit, and I know it's a celebratory historic summit, NATO 75, but we have full-scale war in Europe, and this is. So I know that that's I don't want to put words in the mouth of our leaders, but I'm fairly sure that that's the sentiment that our prime minister and ministers will be coming here to the summit. That okay, yes, let's do some celebrating, but we really need to get our sort of act together. We are getting our act together. I think we're doing a lot to support Ukraine, but it's not fast enough. It's not enough. And second, we need to keep working really hard on our own, strengthening our own defense posture because of the Russian threat. So I think there's a lot of serious discussion that needs to really go on, in addition to, yes, having the few sort of celebratory elements there, of course, but we just can't sort of rest on our laurels and think, okay, this is enough. We don't need to really talk about what's going on. We can't. The war is very maybe not felt so much here, but it's very much felt in Estonia, but I think throughout Europe. It's very close.
It's very close, and this is a very serious moment, as we discussed before coming on stage here. I think for Ukrainian forces, for the West as a collective in terms of our support, as we head into the Washington summit, this will be in many ways one of the key questions: what to do about Ukraine's membership, what to do about your support for Ukraine. Your prime minister has been very clear in terms of seeing NATO as the only really security guarantor for Ukraine. And so do you see any progress being made at the summit on this question, or do you think that the alliance as a collective will continue to sort of tread water?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we have to make progress. I agree, though, that I think so much will depend on the situation on the actual battlefield in 2.5 months' time, something like that.
That's right.
So I think that will be, what the situation will be on the day of the summit will be important. I mean, I don't think it's something that can be kind of overlooked and ignored. And we, of course, hope that the situation won't be as serious as it is today, but it doesn't look all that promising. But then again, we can't also, I think it's Russian sort of disinformation, or in a way propaganda, that things are very, all the doom and gloom surrounding the war. I mean, it is a very serious war, of course, and situation, but we should also try and focus on doing even more. I think, one of the things we think is, of course, we need to think about what more NATO can do on a sort of a practical level. I think allies separately are doing a lot, but the shortfalls are well known. It's ammunition, it's air defense, and what more can we all do to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs in order to win this war? So I think our expectation will be that there'll be some really serious kind of discussions and the tricky part, of course, is the political part. You mentioned the membership issue, and of course we recognize that at this summit there probably won't be an invitation issued to Ukraine, although it's something that we have just supported Ukraine's NATO memberships for I can say almost decades, since at least since the Bucharest summit, if not before. But it's a serious issue that needs consensus, and I think we all recognize, especially after the Vilnius summit, that the consensus on that particular issue isn't there. But that doesn't mean that we can't do a lot to sort of show that Ukraine is moving closer to the alliance, and to help them really prepare for actual membership. I think there's a lot that we actually can do.
There's a couple threads there that I want to pick out. And so one, we talked, I think, at the beginning of this discussion about the vision of Estonian leaders really to take advantage of the moment. And so we had obviously very tragic, unfortunate events going on in the world. There was 9/11. There was Bush had this idea of this opening with Russia, right? He had his "I looked in his eyes" moment. But it also presented an opportunity, right? Because relations between the U.S. and Russia were actually probably at their high point post Cold War in some ways at that moment, and you were able to take advantage of that. But aspirant countries now do not have that advantage. They have all the disadvantages of this full-scale war, which is ongoing, and so. Maybe not just with Ukraine, but with other countries that want to see themselves as part members of the alliance moving forward. How do we keep the open door open in light of the challenges in terms of our obviously degraded relations with Russia at the moment?
I think we need to put the open door policy, which has certainly been a good policy and a successful policy, but into a new context. Because you're right to say we're in a totally new era. And we need to see the open door as a tool for getting rid of gray zones in Europe. I think that's been the problem. We got out of the gray zone when we joined NATO and the EU. Ukraine is still in a gray zone. And as long as we have gray zones in Europe, we're not going to have peace and security ever, like before, or in a new security framework. So I think we need, and I think that, we can already put actually Finland and Sweden's recent accessions into that new context, because in the old context they didn't see a need to join.
That's right.
They joined NATO or they expressed a desire to join the alliance because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine and the deterioration of security in Europe. So I think we need to start kind of thinking, we need to change the paradigm, but using the same tool of open door, which has been a extremely successful. And, and I think when I sort of travel further afield outside of Europe, and sometimes I'm confronted with this Russian narrative of, oh, but NATO enlargement is basically the blame for everything. It's a terrible thing. I always say, but why? For us, we only say it was win-win. I mean, it was totally positive. But so I think that's what we need to do, and we need to really recognize that, like it or not, but it's a new reality that we're living in.
The other thread that I wanted to pick up on was this discussion about practical ways to help Ukraine. So there's been, I think, over the past few months, more of a discussion about Western forces taking some role within Ukraine. I mean, we all know that there's already special forces there, but the French have been talking about this. There's an Estonian general, which I think recently made some remarks about basically taking over some non-combat functions in Western Ukraine to help free up Ukrainian forces there. So how do you see that conversation continuing to snowball? Do you think that this is something that Estonia would do on its own? Would you do it in consort? Where are those sort of discussions within the alliance in terms of actually being very public at least about sending forces to Ukraine?
Well, the discussion started right when French President Macron came up with this idea in March. I think this idea that we should consider a lot of different options, and one of the options is sending boots on the ground, basically sending troops to Ukraine to do not to be in active combat with the Russians, but as you said, to do either training or some sort of special assignments. We have an open mind. And we've said from the beginning, we think that instead of all the time communicating all the things that we're not going to do to help Ukraine or in this aggression, we should communicate things that we will consider. We should take it, and have that kind of communication, which I think is really important. So when President Macron came up with this, and you probably saw our Prime Minister said, okay, well, let's consider. That doesn't mean that we're there's, as far as I know, there isn't sort of an active activity right now or planning of that kind of a mission. But I mean, I think all options are on the table for us anyway. It would be something to consider. We don't know how things are going to progress, but anyway, we're open, I think, to considering different options.
Thank you. I want to give, if anyone in the audience here has a question, please just raise your hand, and I'll Luke Coffey, who's a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute.
Thanks. I wanted to shift gears a bit from Ukraine just slightly to the west to Moldova. It's a pivotal year in Moldova. It's a year of choosing in many ways, with presidential elections in October and also a referendum on whether or not the Moldovans will amend their constitution to allow it to someday join the European Union. But this is also the scene of a lot of Russian hybrid activity. How is this viewed from Tallinn? What can we do collectively to allow and help Moldova along that Euro-Atlantic path in a way that appreciates the complex internal dynamics inside the country? And how can we best prepare for the future of Moldova inside the Euro-Atlantic community? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think the focus, and great question, and I think it's really important that we not forget about Moldova in a way. I mean, we're always clearly and for obvious reasons, the focus is on so much on Ukraine, but also there's Moldova that we have been actually supporting for years, and we must continue to do so. I think our focus has been mostly on their EU integration process. I mean, of course, they're not a NATO candidate, so in a way we keep them that. But most of the work we're doing in the European Union, and including also, we worked very hard before December of last year to make sure that they also get an invitation to start accession negotiations alongside Ukraine. So I think they're moving more or less at the same pace. And now we want to make sure that in June, we open negotiations with these sort of intergovernmental conferences with both countries. So, it's as in the EU, always it's very technical and there are a lot of procedures that you need to go through, but we're definitely watching that they keep moving, that there's always momentum going on. And I think that the key for them will be EU integration. But you're right, I mean, politically, domestically, there's, in a way that's a sovereign country, but you need to keep them providing, I guess, hope and a perspective for the Moldovan people, that they see that it's actually beneficial for them to have closer relations with the European Union. And I think that applies for, so many other candidate countries like the Western Balkans, candidates everywhere, I think. So, and actually the EU finally, I think, is also, well, not finally, but has understood with this, the war, or, okay, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I think in the EU, there's a lot of understanding now that how important enlargement is and how geopolitical it actually is. It's a, it's a real sort of integrating project that brings, prosperity and all of that. So we'll keep working, I think, on mostly along those lines. And supporting them and using our expertise. As I was saying, we're also celebrating 20 years of being in the EU. So we still have some people, myself included, who remember the accession and what we did before to get into the EU and to NATO. And I think we're sharing all of that kind of expertise with, not just with Moldova, but with Ukraine and other countries that are interested and trying to kind of help them in a practical way.
Thomas, I'll come to you in a second. But I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned. So the GDP of Estonia in 2004 was about 12 billion, and now it's northwards of 38 billion. You're a first world country with a lot of innovation. Can you talk about how NATO membership and then just a few months later EU membership transformed Estonia economically within your lifetime, and what that has meant in terms of the how that dovetails with the security picture as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing that NATO did, membership did, is sort of created this trust in that you can invest in Estonia, that it's a sound sort of a market that for investors it's very important, I think, to know that your money won't be, you won't lose basically everything you're investing. So that definitely, I think, helped us hugely. On the EU side, of course, there's so many of these projects that, as I was saying, the whole EU's sort of philosophy is to create kind of equality among, in terms of standard of living among member states. And we're actually really proud of the fact that we've now, in 20 years, achieved, we're almost, at the same level as some much older member states. Soon we're going to probably become a net payer, which probably isn't something that some people in Estonia like, but it's I think it's a source of pride. At least I would say that we've look how far we've come. And how quickly. So I think both helped. NATO helped. Also EU helped immensely, and I think it was the combination of the two together also that was extremely important.
Thank you. Thomas, you had a question.
Good morning. My name is Thomas Janeliūnas. I'm a visiting fellow here at Hudson, and originally I'm from Vilnius. So my compliments to neighbors of Estonia. So my question would be, could you call the most urgent task or the biggest priority right now in Estonia in deterring Russia, or just being prepared for any kind of military escalation? Mm-hmm. And a second part, a bit related to that, Russians are still using this rhetoric of nuclear escalation. Mm-hmm. And some allies, some leaders in NATO countries are quite sensible to this rhetoric. Would you see any role of Estonia just being invited into this discussion about nuclear deterrence of NATO. What Estonians could tell or could advise for other NATO allies, how we could just dismiss this nuclear escalation rhetoric from Russian side. Thanks.
Yeah, great, thank you. Maybe taking the second question first on the nuclear. Of course, we're part of the discussions in NATO, no doubt about that. I think what we can bring to the table is maybe our, I don't want to say expertise, but our experience with Russia, with the Russian kind of narrative, with how the Russians sort of use the nuclear saber rattling at strategic moments in order to sort of benefit, of course, themselves and to try to split the alliance. And I think that's kind of what we can bring to the table. And you can see over the past 2 years, since the Russian aggression started in Ukraine, that at strategic moments when maybe the Russians weren't doing so well on the battlefield or otherwise, then they will bring out the sort of nuclear card and say, and use that. Right now, actually, they're having a big nuclear exercise, even, I think. You know, so I think that it's being used, especially because, as you said, there is quite a lot of sensitivity in certain European capitals. And that's not to say that we shouldn't take nuclear threats seriously, but it's a question about how. But we shouldn't be afraid, you know, and we shouldn't overreact, because that's exactly what the desired effect is. And I just want to say, I think the United States, in terms of responding or reacting, let's say, to Russian nuclear saber rattling, has been, you know, spot on, really sort of measured, you know, and I think that's exactly what needs to be done. It's not, you know, not to go down that path that the Russians sort of want. So I think that's really important. What is a priority for us? It's all about Ukraine. It's because Ukraine's victory will have a direct impact on our security. Ukraine really is fighting right now, basically for our security, and we are doing everything we can to help Ukraine militarily, politically, financially, economically, etc. So, and for example, that's why we have this pledge also of contributing 0.25% of our GDP per year for the next 4 years for providing Ukraine with military assistance. But we've also given a lot, as much as we can. I mean, I think, and in a way, we're reaching maybe the same situation that some other European countries that we. You know, in terms of what we have to give, maybe we're reaching a limit, but that doesn't mean that we can't work on, you know, other sort of joint projects. I think there's a lot going on in Europe, in the EU, and other fora, also NATO, and a lot of sort of work going on and looking at how we can deliver what is needed for Ukraine more quickly. I think that's one of the lessons learned. We've all collectively we've been too slow, and that's why we are in this critical situation now. But I think we can fix that. We can still do more.
Estonia has long been living up to its Article 3 commitments. You're well past 2% of GDP. On the way to 3%, and you talked about your support.
We're at 3.2 this year.
3.2 this year. So I mean, a pacemaker really. I guess behind probably the polls a bit.
Yeah, they're at 4, I think.
They're at 4. You're probably right around where the U.S. is, and with inflation, we're probably only about 2.8%. So that's been a significant, I think, boost in terms of your position here in Washington. And of course, also, I think your support for Ukraine. You think about how much your defense budget, how much your GDP that you're putting towards that. In many ways, I think we're relearning lessons of the Cold War. So you talked about nuclear deterrence, something I think that we're having to relearn. Just yesterday, we had here Sweden's Minister of Civil Defense, and they're relearning their civil defense mechanisms. Can you talk about sort of how Estonia approaches the private sector, non-combat Estonians, civilians, to take part in defending the country, to take part in this mindset of defending Estonia, playing your part?
Yeah, well, I think this has been something that we've been working on for a long time now.
Yep.
But of course, the Russian aggression against Ukraine sort of gave a new, I think, boost, especially when it comes to sort of crisis management or being ready to deal with all kinds of crises. You know, I think Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine has taught us a lot, and our, you know, especially our Ministry of Interior, I think, has been learning a lot in terms of, you know, what you have to do in order to protect society, to make sure that people have information and all that. On the military side, though, we have our Defense League, which maybe is comparable to the National Guard in a way, because it's voluntary, and the Defense League. And when the Russian aggression against Ukraine started, then we saw a huge uptick in people wanting to join the Defense League. But I think even if you don't join the Defense League, I sense, just based on my own sort of family, and that everybody has an understanding that that, you know, it's we all need to do our part, and that everybody needs to kind of be conscious of we are very security conscious. I think as a nation, we have to be, given where we're located, given our history, given our neighbor to the east. So yeah, there's a lot of I think effort there, and I think that's also one of the reasons why the fact that we spend quite a lot on defense, and there's a big discussion that it maybe is not enough, and I think our Chief of Defense Forces, of course, plays with, you know, it was 4%, now it's 5%, you know, and it keeps kind of ramping up. There's a discussion on maybe introducing a defense or security tax in Estonia. You know, it's not there yet, but there's a discussion on it that maybe that's the road we should go down, and that's generally accepted by society. That it's just what we have to do, and maybe it is a bit of this sort of Cold War mentality. Although, you know, I'm not sure. But I mean, back in the Cold War, I know a lot of European allies were spending, you know, above 3%, far above 3% on defense, and I think that's just the future. And if we don't spend, then we don't see how we will able, on the one hand, to strengthen our own posture, the alliance's posture, but how will we be able to keep also supporting Ukraine, for example? So we really need to look at that. I think, and I'm hoping that the Washington summit will also have some focus on defense spending. We're 10 years from the Wales summit and the Wales Defense Investment Pledge. Right.
Sure. Other questions, please let me know. I think that this is an important point about defense spending. You know, this being open and being honest with your public about what you need. The U.S. probably needs to be around 4 or 5% ourselves in terms of being able to rebuild our capabilities to be able to secure our way of life, to secure commerce. But I think, you know, many American politicians are not willing to have that discussion, which it sounds like in Estonia you're having. So I think that that's really an important step forward. Yes, sir, in the second row.
Thank you.
Yep.
What are current prospects for the settlement of and recognition of the border with Russia? I was doing some reading that there was a treaty that was never ratified. I wonder if that's a concern that's far off into the future. What is the status of that these days?
Yes, I haven't had a question on that in a while. It's kind of been put a little bit on hold. So let me go back to 2014 when we signed for the second time, the Estonian-Russian border treaty. And I was actually in Moscow with our foreign minister at the time. And as I was saying, it's been signed. I think we had one reading in our parliament after. But basically it was put on hold because things in Ukraine 10 years ago, as we can recall, started heating up. It was around the same time. And we realized that we're probably not going to have either the political will and momentum in Russia to move forward. Although I have to say, when it comes to the political will and momentum, it's all dependent on Putin, right? I mean, we can
Yes.
we can say that it's the Duma, but we've realized that if so that was one thing, and then also on our side, though, it's we also have different political views, etc. And I think it just been impossible. So, but I do want to say that the border functions as it has functioned, since '91. It functions well. So it would be, of course, nice to have a treaty, a border treaty, just in terms of having that legal clarity. But it doesn't affect the sort of the daily kind of interaction and workings. And so, and we take our responsibility as a country who has a land border with Russia very seriously. As an EU and NATO member, we take guarding that border very, very seriously. And so right now, it's functioning. I don't know. Maybe one day we'll reach it, because I think it's Estonia and Japan that don't have a signed kind of ratified border treaty with Russia, but and for different reasons, obviously.
There's this differences, I think, in the way that different EU countries are approaching their relations with China. Clearly, China is the main benefactor of Russia. It's allowing Russia to propagate its war with war material, political support, diplomatic support. How does Estonia approach this question in terms of your relations with China, and in particular, how those relations are impacted with their support for Russia's war against Ukraine? Mm-hmm. We know the Xi, of course, is in Hungary today. He's visited Serbia. He was in France before that. Mm-hmm. How do you see that conversation moving forward within the European Union as a whole?
Mm-hmm. We're interested in having sort of, pragmatic, constructive relations with China, but we've been also very honest with them in terms of that their sort of increasing relations and very warm relations, it seems, with Russia, that this is a problem for us, obviously, because the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the war, it's existential for us. It's in terms of our security, and that's how we view it, and we've been very honest in telling them that. I mean, I think I was in Beijing in October. We had consultations with them, and so what we can do is describe how we view things and the impact that this aggression is having, not just on European security, but globally. And I think, they listen. We have trade relations with them, of course, and since we left this 16+1, one of the reasons we actually left this sort of format, I guess you can call it, or cooperative platform, was because we wanted to channel our relations with China into either the bilateral channel, which is, as I was saying, constructive, there's dialogue there, there's some trade, etc., or into the EU channel, because so much of the relationship with China, the trade and everything is run through the EU. So we didn't want to have a sort of a third track in a way. We have the two separate tracks that are also very closely linked. But I think the messages, as far as I understand it, that also the U.S. is giving to China are the right ones. That you have to. It's not helpful that China is actually supporting. You can say commercially, but supporting nevertheless Russia in its war, actually the war against Ukraine, by providing certain goods, etc. So, and the whole issue of the sanctions and sanction circumvention is very much on the EU's agenda, and something that the EU is very much following and very serious about.
We're at a perilous moment in many ways for the alliance, also a moment, I think, which is ripe with opportunity. But you look at Estonian society, and I see a lot of optimism in terms of, you talk about this discussions within the country for support for Ukraine, defense spending. Of course, okay, there's a lot of reasons for it, but one of them is security, that the birth rate in Estonia is now 1.8, so not too much lower than the United States, up from 1.3 20 years ago. So clearly there's a belief in some ways in a better future amongst the population. And I think that that's a really optimistic note, despite all the challenges, to sort of end on. But I wanted to give you the opportunity, since our title was Reflections and Lessons, if there's any final reflections or that you would like to put out there, or lessons for those countries like Ukraine who want to be part of the NATO alliance, something for them to be able to hold on to that you think would be particularly useful.
Okay, yes, thank you. And just to sort of add to maybe the optimistic picture, and I mean, I think whereas of course the aggression itself is absolutely terrible. I mean, we've seen some positives out of it, and I think one of them that I think was an unintended consequence was Finland and Sweden joining the alliance. And in terms of the Baltic Sea region, this was a huge, and this has been a huge event. It's a game changer again. So, and I don't think that was something that that Putin was planning. So, therefore, you can always see kind of some positives out of a very kind of a dire and serious situation. And I think and Ukraine, I think when we, in terms of lessons learned, again, having sort of visited now Ukraine several times since the start of the war, it's just incredible how motivated people are. They're fighting for their existence, basically. The Russians have never hidden their Putin, his goal of that, Ukraine is not a nation and a country. So I think that gives hope, that if they have that motivation, then I think they can achieve a lot. And I think but it is up to us to kind of help them along and really see that this is a historic moment, and not to. I think we need to be bold, just like I think back when we were trying to get into NATO, there were all these arguments, as I was saying at the beginning. There was a lot of skepticism. How can we take them in? What will happen? How can we defend them? Are the Baltic states defendable? Well, they are. We are. Look where we are today. And I think that's why we need to really start thinking, I think, along the same lines. Maybe it's more of a lesson for us than for Ukraine and for other sort of aspirants. But I think now is really the time to be bold.
Well, thank you for that, and for this discussion today. We were able to look back, but also forward. Estonia has gone 20 years ago from being a new country who was contributing, really punching above your weight in order to try to, I think, gain additional influence within the alliance. And now you're one of the leaders, I think, especially in terms of your clarity on the Russia threat, in terms of what needs to be done to support Ukraine, the pivotalness of the moment. And so we thank you for that. And we thank you for being here. We thank you, both the audience online and in person, in particular, for joining us today. And Madam Undersecretary, if we can just please give you a round of applause. Thank you for joining us.